so I have the document here, or the paper here, and it says, finally, this study should serve as a warning about reaching definitive paleographical or codicological conclusions based on visual appraisal of the color of the ink alone. Now, I read that and I think that this seems to be directed toward you, you and Dr. Kennard. What are your thoughts on this phrase?
There are the two things that are highly ironic about that statement.
We are going to be talking about the distigmai in Vaticanus and about the egalitarian complementarian discussion. So we're going to break this up into two videos. So the first part, here we go. We're going to talk about the research from Nehemiah Gordon. So Dr. Payne, if you could go ahead and say hello to everybody.
Hi, glad you joined us.
Great. Now you are the guy. You are the distigmai guy. So recent results have come out in Nehemiah Gordon's research, which has basically suggested that the distigmai are not early. Now, you are still advocating for early or a few at least early distigmai. So, can you tell me about your thoughts on Nehemiah's research?
Well, in reading the article, I was first struck with this sounds like a tour de force. And as regards my argument that some of the distigmai go back to the original Scribe B of Vaticanus, a coup de grace, the final dismemberment of that idea. But the closer I examined it, the more I realized that it is fundamentally flawed in many different ways. One thing that sort of a little clues when you begin looking at the article, the title of it is, did the original scribes, plural, write the distigmai in
Right.
Codex Vaticanus B? And yet virtually all scholars agree that the New Testament was written by one scribe. So why? And furthermore, the entire article is about the New Testament distigmai. Never once is the Septuagint mentioned, even though Septuagint is one of the key words listed for the article. So the one defense of making it plural scribes is if one were to include the Septuagint. But since the article doesn't address that, it makes me wonder how much Nehemiah is really aware of background studies on Vaticanus. But more than that is that nowhere in the article does Gordon acknowledge that I had explained to him that none of the distigmai X-ray fluorescence tests that his team had done were on any of the distigmai that I regard as looking identical to the original ink of Vaticanus. It's this odd because he has an introductory statement where he states that Payne and Kennard together identified 11 distigmai that look identical to the original ink of Codex Vaticanus. But then he doesn't test any of those 11. Having highlighted them as so important, why weren't they tested?
So
And
can
then,
I interrupt just really quickly here?
sure,
I want to ask about those 11
yes.
distigmai that you were talking about. So for those who may not be aware, distigmai are basically markings in the margins of Codex Vaticanus, and Dr. Payne, you've discovered essentially that they represent textual variants, so places where a scribe knew that there was a variant there. I think that's generally, agreed upon across the board. Now, what was different between the 11 distigmai that you're talking about and the distigmai that were tested with X-ray fluorescence from Nehemiah Gordon's research?
In addition to the 11 that I had identified with Paul Kennard in the Vatican manuscript vault, later, when the wonderful facsimile came out, color facsimile in 1999, as I went, first of all, let me explain. While I was there in the vault, I remember looking visually at these distigmai in the original manuscript, and then looking at original text right near them in Vaticanus. Uh, and Paul Kennard was looking at them, and I was looking at them. Then we took out an internally lighted loop. And when we did that, each dot that we looked at looked like a huge moon filling our vision. And
Right.
I could see this rich apricot color. And
Mm.
then I'd move the loop over a letter that was not reinforced, not re-inked in the text. And behold, it had the same apricot color. And I remember Paul Kennard looking at the distigmai, looking at the original ink in the text, going back to the distigmai, looking up at me and saying, "C'est le même couleur." It's the
Yeah.
same
Yeah. Yeah.
color. And this is so exciting. But when the facsimile came out, uh, having this vivid memory of these apricot colored distigmai, I thought, I wonder if there are any other distigmai that actually match the original ink of the codex. So I went through and I found uh, 40, 40 additional ones that had an ink color that was somewhat like the apricot. The vast majority of them were clearly darker than the original
Right.
ink on the same page, but still there's a somewhat of an apricot tone, uh, either similar to or at least different than the brown color. So
Right.
I sent this list to Paul Kennard and said, would you be able to check and see if any of these also match the original ink of the Codex? Uh, well, he then spent a long time. Finally got the answer back from me, and he said, I have gone through every distigmai in Vaticanus, and I have identified 40 cases with the same apricot color that we saw together. Well, I was surprised but delighted that he was able to find so many when my examination had only found a few. Uh,
Right.
well, I wrote up the analysis of the textual variants in these passages. Um, Paul Kennard asked if he could read it to the New Testament the Vaticanus colloquium in Geneva, and I was glad to give him my permission. And then when the colloquium essays were published, they included that article with Paul Kennard's approving response. In retrospect, I wish I had insisted that I go to the Vatican again and confirm that these really do match the original ink of the Codex. But I didn't, and I simply accepted
Right.
Paul Kennard's word on it. And I think he had good reason to accept his word because we had worked together. And
Sure.
in 11 of these cases, uh, we had agreed this matches the original ink in the Codex. Um, and so when he said I found another 40, I assumed he was using the same rigorous criteria uh, for matching original ink. I went back again over those 40, and of the 40, uh, 7 of them to me appeared to match the original ink just like the original 11.
Right.
And I can list all of those. When Nehemiah Gordon and his team tested them, they only tested one of those 7. The other ones they tested were from other the ones not included in the 7 that I regard as original.
Okay.
Interestingly, Nehemiah Gordon, even though he says none of the distigmai matched original ink, one of them, his testing showed that what both Paul Kennard and I had identified as an apricot color original ink
Yep.
they did test. And lo and behold, its ink signature was identical to the original ink, exactly the same percentage of copper. And
Okay.
uh, uh, Nehemiah Gordon said, there is no doubt that matches the original ink, but it's not a distigmai.
Right.
It's actually a sigma. When I first read that, I looked at it. I said, "How do you get a sigma out of this?"
Mm.
Because a sigma is like an English C in shape. It
Yeah, yeah.
has a stroke that goes over the top, connecting, and
Yep.
down the side and across the bottom. But the two dots are not connected. There's no ink between them that would connect them. And so I asked uh, Gordon, what about this? Do you have any images of the this particular distigmai that makes you think it's a sigma? And he sent me 4 different images. In
Yep.
3 of them, the sigma was not at all visible. In the ultraviolet 50-time magnification, I
Yep.
could see at the bottom of the right dot what looked like it is in the right position to be the end of the lower curved stroke of a sigma.
Okay.
And then if you imagine ink, not visible now, but if you imagine it connecting it to the left dot, and if you imagine it connected to the top, then yeah, it could be a sigma. Now, it would be a very
Mm.
unusual sigma because
Right.
normally a sigma is circular shaped and
Yeah.
roughly the same distance from top to bottom and right to left. In this
Yeah.
case, it's over twice as wide as a normal sigma,
Do you
very
remember
flattened.
do you remember what the reference is to that? What
Yeah,
passage it is?
1241b9. The 2 dots are on the right margin. Um, And I think based on the ultraviolet image that it probably was a sigma because that would explain the features that I could see in that large magnification, and I could imagine the other parts there.
Mhm.
However, uh, as the article is written, it talks about the repetition of a sigma on the following line in order to show a different opinion regarding where the syllabification should be.
Right.
Uh, Matthew 8:2 is where this one that's in question occurs. In
Okay.
Matthew 8:5, there is the identical words pro, and then the rest of the verb histemi on the next line. And there, after the pro, there is no sigma in Vaticanus, but a sigma has been added on the next line.
Right.
So in this case, there is no doubt whatsoever that the corrector was adding a sigma that was not originally in the text. And then
Okay.
in verse 19, just a little bit later, there's another instance of the same verb uh, and with the pro at the end of one line and the rest of histemi in the next line. And in that case, the again, the scribe has broken the identical word and put at the beginning of the next line a sigma, and in both cases, changing prohistemi into proshistemi.
Oh, okay.
Now,
Okay.
so it changes the meaning from uh, a, from go forward or
Yeah, yeah.
approach to the personal sense of approaching a person. So,
Hmm.
point is that Gordon did not give any indication that there was any doubt whatsoever about this being a sigma. He simply
Right.
asserts twice It is a sigma, therefore it doesn't count. But my point is that by dismissing that evidence, uh, he gives the impression that we have tested all of the different kinds of, in fact, repeatedly he says, we tested the apricot ones, we tested the chocolate ones, and
Yep.
they're all this late ink.
Yep.
And if he had acknowledged there is dispute here whether this is a sigma, then he
Hmm.
would have introduced some doubt into his fundamental conclusion that all the distigmai are from the 16th century. Uh, the I could go into much more detail, but the thing that concerns me is that both before the SBL convention speech and
Yep.
before writing this article, I identified to Gordon in precise detail exactly why each of the 8 that he called apricot distigmai
Hmm.
were not apricot, and
Right.
how they were different from the original ink and the lightness of the original ink of Codex Vaticanus. And I furthermore said, if you don't make this clear, readers will misinterpret it as though you had tested the ones that really do look like the original Vaticanus ink. There are the original 11 that he had highlighted.
Yep.
There are the additional 6, and if you include that sigma uh, distigma
Mhm.
question, then that would be 7. But there, but none of the 17. And so, since I agreed that graphically from the ultraviolet 50-time magnification image, I think that probably or was more likely to be a sigma than 2 dots. I think there's enough evidence for that, but it's not a slam dunk case. And
Right.
but none of the 17 were tested. So it's when he says we have proved, and he uses the word proved,
Yeah.
when we have proved that these could not possibly have been from the 4th century. None of the distigmai could have been. They're all from the 16th century. Well, it's like someone saying there's no automobile on this property. I looked in the garage. I looked in the backyard. I looked inside the kitchen. I looked in the garden. And there's no car. But he never looked
Right.
in the garage.
Right.
If you don't look where they're most likely to be, you can't say there's no car on the property.
Right. So, coming back to the original question, I think we went on for about 20 minutes there. That's good. I think we meandered a little bit on the Sigma stuff, which is interesting. But is there like an overarching, like, is it just simply that the 11 distigmai that you're talking about, is it just simply that they're plain and simple apricot? And then the other ones that were tested were not straight up apricot. Is that what's
Oh
going on
yeah,
there?
yeah, yeah. In fact, before the SBL presentation, and
Yep.
after I'd explained to Gordon that uh, these 8 that you have tested are not the same apricot color as the original ink. Uh, he said, "Well, I think maybe what I'll do is I'm going to describe uh, the 8 that I have tested
Mhm.
as not apricot, and then the other ones is chocolate." Uh, and so I thought he was going to make it clear, but he didn't.
Right. So I would be curious though, because the way that I understand the situation or the issue with Vaticanus and the distigma is if there was an original scribe that went in and put the distigma in. We know that another scribe came later. I don't know when later. I think that's up in the air. But they came and they re-inked a bunch of faded stuff, and it's been suggested that they possibly re-inked the distigma as well. So there would be situations where you would have an original distigmai there, and then it re-inked. But then I think in the paper there's a reference to a couple in which some of the apricot color was visible underneath the chocolate. And so the apricot portion was segregated, and then the XRFC testing was done on the apricot portion of the distigmai, and that came out with a different ink. Or not a different ink, but it came out with the same kind of ink as the chocolate color. So is that not valid in your view?
Oh, no, no. I think the testing he has done is valid. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm no expert in ink analysis, X-ray fluorescence, how deep into the ink the X-ray fluorescence takes data, uh, how uh, how much precedence the upper layer of ink has to the lower. If in that case, the things I can't judge, but I think he
Yeah.
has demonstrated this, and on several points, I have changed my opinion. One of them is I now believe that it is a minority of distigmi that go back to the original manuscript.
Okay.
How much of a minority? Uh, I am eagerly awaiting a testing of those other 17. Because if, uh, in one sense, I'm confident they will match the original ink signature, because in the two cases where I did predict uh, and said, this to me looks like original ink, in both
Yep.
of those cases, the X-ray fluorescence test that Gordon did confirmed it does match the original ink. Uh,
Okay.
in every, there's 64 tests that were done on distigmai, and every one of them agreed with my assessment based on the visual appearance. I think Nehemiah Gordon is right that one should not make absolute assertions about dating based simply on color.
Hmm.
Uh, but, then he goes on to prove that when one uses a definition of apricot that simply means similar to,
Right.
not identical to, but
Yep.
similar to, not the
Okay.
same lightness, but darker, but still similar to. If you understand ink color in that way, then he's correct.
Okay.
It should not be. In fact, he has proved that the kind of definition of apricot that Paul Canard used to make those 40 uh, is an invalid basis for determining original ink. And he's
Okay.
proved it in eight cases. In one case, Canard he found was correct, but he determined it's not a distigma, it's a sigma. Uh, but remember, there are 40 of these,
Right.
and he's doing uh, only 8 tests. And out of 8 tests, you'd expect one of them to coincide with an original one, given the
Right.
percentage of actual original ones. You would be lucky to get more than one when testing that few.
Right.
Uh, and so it's not surprising to me at all that he got the results he did. Uh, the but I agree with him in the first case. Most of the distigmae that were tested did indicate the use of a refined ink with a very low copper concentration,
Yep.
indicative of a use of ink that is later. Now,
Okay.
if you read his footnotes, the
Yeah.
Chinese were doing this and had documented it by 1087,
Right.
and he cited 4 articles about 13th century Spanish refined ink, and uh, another part of Europe where there was 14th century refined ink evidence. So saying because it's refined, therefore it's 16th century at the earliest,
Hmm.
that his conclusions contradict the data in the footnotes,
Right.
but
Which seems to suggest that it, yeah.
nevertheless, I agree with him that
Hmm.
most of the distigmai were added later. And I agree that in some of the 16, what I call distigmai obeli symbols, that they were not distigmai obeli symbols. I think in 5 cases, he has demonstrated that they were not, uh, those distigmai were not written at the time Scribe B was writing.
Right.
Uh,
And Scribe
in
B is
10
the
other,
reinker, right?
no, Scribe B is the original scribe,
Ah,
uh,
gotcha.
and the later uh, person who was adding these distigmai uh, did it long after the 4th century, and I agree with that. What I would really like to know is, what about those 17?
Right.
How many of them match the original ink, like the one at 1241b9? And how
Okay.
many of them are later ink? Uh, they sure look to me to be the same. And
Right.
my judgment's been right in every one so far. But I mean, I would not be surprised if some of those are later. But I have to see the testing.
Okay.
And
So I
the probability of there being original ink under the 10 that need more testing uh, depends on the results of those tests. And I
Mhm.
can't predict what that'll be.
Yeah, so a question kind of comes to my mind while we're talking about original ink. We know that Vaticanus that the lettering began to fade, and so a scribe went over top of that to kind of rebolster this really nice, expensive manuscript, right? Just to keep it moving, right? Um, so these 11 distigma or 17 that you're talking about, how come they don't appear to be faded like the rest of the text if it was done with the original scribe?
Oh, they are faded. Well, the
Oh,
seven
okay.
the 17 original ink distigmi are faded just like the original manuscript. And that's why
Okay.
I think they're original. And the color identity too.
Right. And is we're going to talk about First Corinthians 14, 34, and 35. Is that one of the original distigmi?
No, that is not one of the original distigmi, but and the reason I know that is because it's darker than the original ink.
Mhm.
However, Gordon did not test that. It's one of the things
Right.
that I wish he tested, because uh, that's the one that theologically makes so much difference. But
Right.
what I am confident of now is, and I've got a lot
Hmm.
of reasons to believe this, is that there are probably 16. I may be wrong on a few of them, but there are probably 16 instances where the original scribe of Vaticanus wrote an obelus. Whether the
Right.
scribe also wrote a distigme, that depends on more testing. Uh,
Right.
but for instance, if those 10 tests are done that need to be tested in order to know, if they show, instead of now 0.01 copper, if
Yep.
they show zero point 0.1 copper, uh, then that would indicate it is not the refined ink. And even though the re-inking may have been the refined ink, the percentage of copper is way too high for
Mhm.
refined ink when some of the ink under it. But here, I don't know how accurately one can predict those things.
Right.
So,
Right.
my belief is that Scribe B used obeloi to mark the locations of multi-word interruptions of the original text, and that the Scribe B, in every case, left a gap in the text at the
Right.
precise point where a four or more consecutive word insertion begins.
Right.
Now, the reason I think this is probable to be going back to the original scribe is that only the original scribe can leave a gap in the text.
That's right.
Once the
Yeah.
text
Otherwise,
is
you would
written,
see it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, if there was no, for instance, there's one case in 1390 where on page 1390 where there is a later ink distigmai, and Gordon proved it's a later ink with this refined ink.
Yeah.
And there is a horizontal bar, which unfortunately he did not test
Right.
because I am really interested whether they were written at the same time. Uh, because they look like they're by the same scribe because both have downward dipping ink.
Right.
So here's a scribe who understood the purpose of the distigmai obolus and who added a new one, but could not put a gap in the text because the text was already written.
Right.
Now, the reason I think that these 16, or most of the 16, uh, were an original Scribe B apricot obolus is that in three cases, Gordon has proved that those oboli in what I call oboli do match the original ink of the Codex.
Okay.
And he's got photographs showing the original at a 26% different angle than the later re-inking. So he's got, I think, proof that these are original. So, and the implication of the article is that probably most of the others are too, but I await that testing.
Right. Right.
So the point is that if the original scribe did not write oboloi and the original scribe did not write distigmai, then why in the 16 cases where you have is unusual graphic combination using purely graphic data, there's 17 times in the New Testament where you have a bar that sticks out in the margin farther than most bars by a distigmai line, and actually 72.5% farther into the margin than on average the other ones,
Right.
and is longer than most of the other ones. There's 17 cases that fit that. 16 of those occur on a line where there is a four or more consecutive word insertion that interrupts the original text in some manuscripts. Well, that's pretty. If you look at every instance of a four or more consecutive word insertion listed in either the Nestle-Aland text or Swanson's more detailed text, this only occurs on average once every 83.5 lines of text. Now imagine rolling a die that has 83 and a half sides on it,
Yeah.
and only one of those matches up. And you roll the die 17 times, and 16
Right.
of those, you get the dot. Is it
Right. Right.
coincidence? The odds of even only 8 of those doing that is less than 1 in 10 to the 15th power. That's 15
Right.
zeros after the 1. It's not likely that this is a chance thing. And
Okay.
since we know that Scribe B in Isaiah explained the meaning of the obolus and said the obolus marks where a text was added that was not in the original text. And he's got a little abbreviation. It uses the word obolus. And he's defining what it does. In all three cases, the scribe left a gap at the precise point where the Septuagint text inserts words that are not in the Hebrew text. So
Okay.
we know that Scribe B had that pattern. So if Scribe B wrote these oboli, and it to me it makes perfectly good sense in the Septuagint, Scribe B 121 times used an obelus, and almost all of them are just a bar. Some of them have two dots with them, but most are just a bar. So it would it would not be unusual to me if the obelisk by itself was the symbol that Scribe B used to mark these multi-word insertions. But if it was not Scribe B, how do we explain this co-occurrence of 4 or more consecutive word insertions in 16 out of 17 of these graphically distinct
Right, right.
bars? It's just, it begs for an explanation. The way that, by the way, Gordon himself uses the color and lightness of ink as the basis for every one of his tests where he says this was the original ink of Vaticanus. If the color
Right.
and lightness doesn't tell you, he would have no way of knowing that this letter new on this line is original ink.
Well,
Then he
I have
assert,
to interrupt there because I don't think that was the point that he was making in his paper. So my understanding is he was talking about the certainty with which I'd have to pull it. I have it here, but it's a long document. But he was suggesting that the results are relative. So he's not speaking in the sense of, this shows that this is original and this isn't, but rather he's showing a relationship to the type of ink per the type of per place tested, right? So the example I think used that I could use from his paper is that he tested the ink in Hebrews, which is a later edition because Hebrews was damaged or whatever. So a later scribe added that minuscule. And then some of that ink came out the same as certain other inks earlier on in Vaticanus. So I don't think he's making that. Perhaps it was said in there, but I think the general gist is that we're testing what appears to be apricot and what appears to be chocolate, and then these are how they relate to each other. At least that's my
wait,
understanding of how the paper was written.
that is what he's stating about
Mhm.
distigmai.
Yes.
But there are dozens of places in the article where Gordon asserts the original ink of Vaticanus
Yep.
has this composition chemically.
Hmm.
And uh, how does he know that it's original ink?
Right.
In every case, he knows it's original ink because he looks at the text, he looks at the image, he
Yep.
sees the surrounding chocolate text, and here's
Yep.
one letter in the middle of chocolate text. It's apricot,
Right.
and it's fainter. And he says that's original. It
Hmm.
wasn't re-inked. How does he know it was original? It was on the basis of the color and the
Right.
faintness of the ink.
I see what you're
And
saying.
my point is, he and every textual scholar uses color and ink and faintness to determine original ink in Vaticanus. There is
Right.
no exception. And so his conclusion that you can't make judgments about original ink based on color and faintness is he's used it himself.
Right.
The
Right.
point is it identical to the color and faintness? If it isn't, then you've got grounds for believing it's not original.
All right. So let's do one more point on this. I just want to get your opinion. This is less scholarly, but so at the very end of the article, Dr. Nehemiah Gordon appears to write like a scathing warning. And so I have the document here, or the paper here, and it says, finally, this study should serve as a warning about reaching definitive paleographical or codicological conclusions based on visual appraisal of the color of the ink alone. Now, I read that and I think that this seems to be directed toward you, you and Dr. Kennard. Uh, what are your thoughts on this phrase?
There are the two things that are highly ironic about that statement. The first is that Gordon himself based every judgment of what is original ink in Vaticanus on the color and lightness.
Hmm.
He himself did that. He doesn't acknowledge it, but the very fact that he says, these are original and here's their ink composition, the only way he could know they're original is based on the color and lightness. So number one, he's disputing. But what really is true about that is it's only where the ink really does match the original ink color and lightness
Right.
that you can draw those conclusions. Just because they're similar, that's not. Then ironically, he used the definition of apricot in the same wrong way that Canard did in order to prove that Canard was wrong. And then in his conclusion, he said, you cannot make determinative paleographical conclusions based on ink color. But he does make conclusive paleological conclusions without testing a single distigmai that does match the original ink of the Codex. So
Right.
he's doubly unfair to himself and to me.
Great. All right. Well, Dr. Payne, thank you so much for coming on and kind of defending your position in light of the recent research. Anyway, brothers and sisters, thank you for joining us. And until next time, we'll see you around.